Once you've finished writing your novel, having poured countless hours of work into hundreds of pages, you'll probably need to send it to a literary agent. Literary agents are the gatekeepers to getting your work in front of a traditional publisher, and they can be brutal. Initially, most of them will only allow you to submit the first 3 chapters or 15,000 words of your manuscript along with a synopsis. In practice, they might stop reading after the first page if it doesn't hook them, or even the first paragraph. An agent might receive dozens of submissions a week and only be able to take on 2 to 3 new authors a year, so your work needs to stand out. Short story writers tend to be very good at grabbing your attention very quickly, because they only have a few thousand words to work with in total. This means we can learn a lot from them about how to make our opening chapters impactful enough to hook an agent. Harlan Ellison was a master of the sci-fi short story, shooting to prominence in a world otherwise dominated by long-form novels and movies. As a person, he's remembered for being provocative and argumentative, once being called the only living organism whose natural habitat is hot water. But as a writer, he's known for his vivid, impactful prose. In this video, I'll be analysing one of Ellison's short stories, Along the Scenic Route. It's from a collection called The Beast That Shouted Love at the Heart of the World. I'll take you through the key story beats and then draw out the techniques you can use to make your own writing more impactful, whether it's a short story or the opening chapter of your novel. Before we dive in though, I'd like to say a big thank you to one of my subscribers, Kurt Navarro, for suggesting a video on Harlan Ellison. Doing the research has been a blast. So let's get going, and as always, there'll be spoilers throughout. The story opens with the line, "The blood-red Mercury with the twin-mounted 7.6mm Spandaus cut George off as he was shifting lanes." And what an opening line. Both vivid in its imagery and doing a great job of foreshadowing the story ahead. If I asked you to guess what the rest of this story is about based just on that line, almost all of you would guess Road Warrior style action, and you'd be right. George's wife Jessica, who is in the passenger seat next to him, tries to dissuade him from pursuing the Merc, but he says bluntly, "My masculinity is threatened." So now, as well as the plot and the protagonist, we've established the key theme of the story, just 1.5 minutes in on audiobook. George calls some kind of telephone exchange to challenge the driver of the Merc to a duel, but is warned the Merc is far more heavily armed than his piranha. Jessica again tells him to back down, but we're told that 2 blotches of anger spread on George's cheeks. Wonderfully figurative language. George accepts the fight. "Opponent confirmed, sir. Good luck," says the operator. The point of no return. As George catches up the Merc, its driver calls him using a point-to-point communication system and taunts him. The confrontation escalates and George prepares to fire a laser at the Merc, expecting it will end the duel, but the Merc evades easily. "Now see what you've gotten us into?" Jessica chides, as they realise the extent of the disadvantage they're at. The driver of the Merc engages the communication system again, and this time uses a video link. We learn he's just a teenager named Billy with a face covered in acne. He makes sexualized comments about George's wife and then tells George he's going to die. In desperation, George decides to try an illegal move, a tight turn across the lanes at 250 miles per hour. It fails to stop the Merc and he gets a warning from a police helicopter which appears overhead. He's told not to break the rules of the duel again. In a moment of introspection, George feels the universe settling like silt over him. A wonderful phrase, combining a simile with a metaphor, conveying everything we need to know about how George is feeling at this point. George is beaten and thinks he'll need to eject from the car to save his and Jessica's life. "How did I get into this?" he pleads with himself. "Dear God, I swear if you get me out of this, I'll never, never, never go mad like this again. Please, God." But then bumpers collide once more, and we're told that naked barbarism took hold. George wanted to kill now, not crash the other, not wound the other, not stop the other, kill the other. All messages to God were forgotten. He takes his chance and fires the laser at Billy's head, but he cries, screams, and curses when Billy's windshield deflects it. Now it's Billy's turn to go in for the kill. Jessica has lost consciousness. George tries to get away. He let the propellers to full spin and reached for eternity, we're told. He gets up to 300 miles an hour before he hears a sizzling and realizes Billy is using an inductor beam to melt through his car and destroy it. Ellison's figurative lines are now rolling off the page one after the other, even as the two vehicles increase their speed and the intensity of their battle. This really sets the tone and atmosphere. We're told that George thought wildly until the thought slipped through his panic. He rolls down a window and the wind made a death's head of Jessica's features. George uses a clever trick to blast the Merc up into the air, using the air bubble it was floating on against it, and he watches as Billy, just a teenager, is thrown around his car, which explodes as it hits a barrier. Billy is dead. George is called by the same telephone operator who arranged the duel and is congratulated. He's told that Billy was the #1 duelist in the region. George will receive a big check for his win, along with the notoriety of winning the duel. He decides he's a family man though, with a family car. He never wants to use the car this way again. That was some other George, certainly not him. Jessica and George embrace as she soothes him, saying he had to do what he did. Then the operator cuts back in, and George finds out he has 15 new challengers who want to duel with him. The first is already on their way. George wants to escape, but he realizes he now has to fight. He's changed and grown, but as we're told in the closing line, in the world of the freeway, there is no place for a walking man. So, what are the key lessons here for us as writers? I think there are 3 big ones. The first is how Ellison masterfully uses literary devices to make a small number of words have a really big impact line to line. The opening line combines colourful imagery, symbolism, and foreshadowing in just 3 words. The blood red Mercury. Red helps us instantly picture the car which has just shot past. Blood foreshadows the type of story this will be, combined with the Spandau machine guns. Even Mercury, which is establishing how Ellison is going to refer to the other car, the Merc, is also a god of trickery and travellers in Roman myth, further foreshadowing the type of story this will be and its ending. Throughout, Ellison uses simile and metaphor, like describing a booming noise made by the Merc as being like a fist in the ear. But my favourite is George felt the universe settling like silt over him, which is a simile of the silt wrapped in the broader metaphor of the universe. It's also something of an epigraph, the use of a well-known phrase. In this case, the weight of the universe being on George is an exaggerated form of the phrase that someone has the weight of the world on their shoulders. This technique helps us to understand what Ellison is conveying in as few words as possible, because we already know the phrases. Ellison similarly ups the pace and reduces the word count by condensing sentences. For example, 2 blotches of anger spread on George's cheeks. He could have said, 2 blotches of red appeared on George's face. He was angry. But as a skilled writer, Ellison knows that if he describes the blotches and the anger, the audience will see the red without him ever having to mention it. Ellison makes other lines jump out by use of contradictions and oxymoron. For example, he thought wildly. We'd usually consider thoughtfulness as the opposite of wildness. Other techniques he uses are creating a constant sense of motion and physicality, even for abstract concepts. The thought slipped through his panic. He can be very direct as well, having George outright state the theme of the story with, "My masculinity is threatened." And he uses dialogue as a method to show, not tell, as in, "Dear God, I swear, if you get me out of this, I'll never, never, never go mad like this again. Please, God." Secondly, as well as his mastery of utilizing literary devices in his line-to-line writing, Ellison also manages to create a vivid world with very, very little work. We understand that this is a Mad Max-like setting in very few words. This isn't easy for him to achieve, especially remembering this story was first published back in 1969, way before his audience would have been familiarized with this type of setting and concept. He does this, like many new wave sci-fi writers, by combining the futuristic and fantastic elements of his story with a mundane, almost nostalgic version of 1950s or 60s America. This creates a really unnerving sense of anachronism, while also drastically reducing the amount of world building Ellison needs to do to make the story work. And finally, he manages to tell a complete and well-paced story in around 24 minutes. If you take a look at the key beats of the story, they line up surprisingly well to the content and timings of the corresponding beats in the 3-act structure. We have a great hook with the blood red merc, a brush with the main conflict when George asks for the duel, a point of no return when the duel is confirmed, a couple of pinch points via his calls with Billy, a midpoint with both a mirror moment where Jessica tells George he's supposed to be a family man, and a false plot victory when he thinks his initial laser attack will end the fight. A dark night of the soul as George thinks wildly and panics. A climax to conflict when Billy is killed. And a resolution when we see George has changed as a person but will have to carry on fighting anyway. If you'd like a deeper dive on the 3-act structure and how to use it, check out my last video. I promised at the beginning of this video that we could learn a lot about making an impactful opening to our novels from short story writers like Ellison, and I thought it might be useful to include a few examples of authors doing just that. First is Ellison himself, who tells what feels like it could be a pretty self-contained short story about a trip to a post-apocalyptic cinema in the first chapter of his award-winning and movie-adapted novella, A Boy and His Dog. It's in the same collection as Along the Scenic Route, so if you want to check it out, do so, although I do have to give you a trigger warning, as this is an extremely disturbing story in terms of sexual and physical violence. The opening chapter of A Game of Thrones is a self-contained prologue where we see a group venturing north of the Wall and encountering the White Walkers, or the Others. They won't be seen in the books for quite some time, but it features some of George R.R. Martin's most visual writing, with great foreshadowing of what the series will eventually be about. In the opening chapter of the award-winning Children of Time by Adrian Tchaikovsky, we see the point of view of the megalomaniac genius of Rana Kern, in what could easily be a self-contained short story about the fall of an empire and the fine line between confidence and arrogance. This is one of my favourite books and favourite chapters of all time, so please do check it out. As a bit of homework, the next time you start reading a new book and you really enjoy the opening chapter, try to spot how many of Harlan Ellison's techniques you can see in it. And if you don't enjoy the first chapter of your next read, think about how these techniques might have improved it. Finally, if you already have a writing project on the go, then revisit your opening chapter and think about how you could use these techniques to improve it and make it more impactful. Think about that agent that might only read the first few lines. What's going to keep them going? I'll link all the books and videos I've mentioned below, although it's worth saying that most of Ellison's work is out of print at the moment due to a rights issue, so you can only buy the audiobooks and second-hand versions. One more big shout out to Kirk Navarro for suggesting this video. If any of you have any suggestions for areas of writing theory or authors you'd like to see covered, let me know in the comments below. I'll do my best to react or reply to every single comment and add any good ideas to my roadmap for future content. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe and hit the notification bell. This is a brand new channel, but if enough people like the video, I'll keep producing Write Like a Legend videos like this one.